Good to be here.
Yeah.
All right.
That was it. We did, yeah, no, you're right. We had we did. We did have the spiel on the floor. Sure
Well,
it is, because
It's a standing room only crowd here in the boardroom. I joke.
Bringing some water. We're not so uncouth here, so that's what we can afford, some water. How many people are?
Actually, on a laptop, how many people do you see?
We have a few minutes. All right. I'm gonna ask.
Is she on computer?
I should put in.
There's something on the left and the bottom. It's like somebody going to computer. It's easy to get the light to go. Call Jake. Yeah, to get Eva to see it, but she can have, she's there, but she can't get the volume.
Thank you.
Oh, there she is, Eva.
Oh.
Thank you. Okay, in the meantime, I've dropped links into the chat of the two pieces that I had sent out in advance for tonight. One, a series of teshuvot, of rabbinic responsa from the Rabbinical Assembly, and one, an excerpt from a piece by my grandfather, Rabbi Lewittes. Okay, so it's 7:31. Everybody can hear me okay? Yeah, great. Okay, so we're going to start. It is really nice to be live streaming here from the boardroom at Shari Zion Beth-El, and it's great to be all together. Those of you joining us from Toronto, Montreal, New York, and wherever else you may be. We're going to start as I always do, which is to offer a nigun, a wordless melody in the tradition of the Hasidim, to center ourselves, to open our minds and open our hearts to do business with the Torah that we're here to study tonight. And bonus points for those of you who can explain why I chose this particular nigun for our study tonight. So I have a couple of people in the room with me. I'm going to be looking at you. I'm going to be looking at the screen, and we're going to jump into a really interesting topic. The topic for tonight is what we refer to as Yom Tov Sheini Shel Galiyot, or the second day of Yom Tov that's observed in the diaspora. And the question before us tonight is a question about the ongoing relevance and appropriateness of observing a second day of Yom Tov outside of the land of Israel? Is it a practice that continues to enrich our spiritual lives? For those of us living outside of Israel, does it have value? Does it have purpose? Where does it come from? And how do we engage in this question with integrity and respect, both for the historic application of this tradition and for the continuing evolution of science, of mathematics, and of Jewish practice and identity? So let's jump right in. The main source that talks about the observance of the three main pilgrimage festivals comes from the book of Bamidbar. I'll just very quickly in English, we read how on the first month, on the 14th day of the month, there should be a Passover sacrifice to God. On the 15th day of that month, a festival. Unleavened bread, this of course is talking about Pesach. The operative parts of the verse for us, the first day shall be a sacred occasion, should be a religious celebration. You shouldn't work your occupations. And the seventh day should be a religious celebration, a sacred occasion for you. Don't work again. I'm going to ask everybody to mute, please, just so that we can hear each other better. When it comes to the festival of Shavuot, again, we have on the first day of the first fruits, your Feast of Weeks. When it comes to Sukkot, again, 7 days you shall observe a festival of God. So bottom line is that the Torah makes it pretty clear that it's 7 days of the Chag for Pesach and for Sukkot. Only the first day and the last day are what we refer to as Yom Tov. And for Shavuot, only 1 day and 1 day of Sheini Atzeret, which is the add-on holiday at the end of the week of Sukkot, which we in the outside of Israel observe as 2, Sheini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. Originally, all of these festivals were agricultural festivals. It was later on that the rabbis added spiritual or historical themes to them. But it's very practical for the Torah to have told us exactly when these things start, because you need to know when the start of the month is, right? You have to know when Rosh Chodesh is, when the start of the month is, if you're going to be able to count to the 14th of the month to start your holiday, or to the 6th of the month to start your holiday if it's Shavuot. Knowing when the new moon arrives is key to being able to plan for the rest of your calendar. They all start in the middle of the month, except, of course, for which holiday? Rosh Hashanah, which starts on the first of the month. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. How does all this work? What's the word?
Recap.
A quick recap, thank you, of the Jewish calendar. Jewish calendar has 12 lunar months in a leap year. We have 13 lunar months. A lunar month, of course, is the number of days that it takes the moon to circle the earth. The appearance of the new moon, the sliver, is a signal that it's Rosh Chodesh, that a new moon has begun. What would happen? Witnesses who would see this sliver of a new moon would come to the rabbinical court in Jerusalem, to the Sanhedrin, and they would say, I want to testify that I have seen the new moon. And once the rabbis in charge there deem these witnesses to be reliable witnesses, they proclaim Mikudash, Mikudash, the new moon has been declared, and then everybody is now able to calculate when is the 14th going to be, when is the 6th going to be. But how did that happen? How did the establishment of the new moon get communicated to all the other Jewish communities waiting to hear? So what they would do is they would climb to the top of mountains and they would light bonfires on the top of mountains in order to signal to cities that the new moon had been declared. Look, everybody pretty much knows when the new moon is going to be seen, but am I seeing it on the first day, the first moment that it appears? Am I seeing it a little bit late? When you look out for the bonfire, you know that the religious authorities are declaring that it has, in fact, started. So they would light bonfires on the top of the mountains in Jerusalem. Neighboring cities would see them and light their own bonfires, and on and on and on, including all the way through Egypt and Babylonia, so that everybody would know when to mark Rosh Chodesh. What happened was that there were some smart alecks, really, of people who were challenging rabbinical authority, whether it's groups like the Samaritans or others, who lit fires at the wrong time in order to confuse people, right? This was a way of engaging in civil disobedience, saying, I reject your authority and I'll make my own determinations as to when the calendar should be declared. So the rabbis, trying to circumvent the disruption caused by these challengers, instead started to send messengers on horseback to tell outerlying cities that the new moon has started and start counting your days to the holidays. But what happens is that when you're lighting fires, you can communicate much more quickly than you can by sending people on horseback. And so they were limited in terms of how far away the cities were that they were able to reach to tell them that the holiday had started. And so because people were uncertain if they hadn't got the message, and were concerned that they might be celebrating on the wrong day if they go by their own calculations and not by the rabbis, the tradition started to institute a second day of Yom Tov as a buffer in order for those far-flung communities to achieve a sense of certainty that at least one of the days that they were observing of the holiday would most likely be the actual day on which it was mandated to be observed. And that tradition was known as Yom Tov Sheini Shel Galuyot, the second day of Yantiv within the diaspora or within those further flung communities. Now, when Maimonides talks about this, Rambam makes it very clear that it was only observed in communities that the messengers couldn't reach. Right? It was a practical thing, and it was mishum safek. It was because of the concern about the doubtfulness that those communities had as to which day exactly was the right day. But if communities could be reached, even if they were further flung, then they only observed one day. Right? So it wasn't only about distance. It was about, did I get the memo? Right? If I got the memo, I knew when to observe, and one day was sufficient. If I didn't get the memo, I observed 2 days. Rashi also makes it clear that this practice was only observed insofar as communication wasn't possible. If communication was possible, then only one day was observed. Now, sometimes on Rosh Hashanah...
Am I muted?
No, you're not, but I can help with that. Sometimes on Rosh Hashanah, even in Israel, 2 days were observed because oftentimes the witnesses wouldn't get to the Sanhedrin, wouldn't get to the rabbinical court until much later in the day when, if you say, oh yeah, today was Rosh Chodesh, then if the day, like the first day of Rosh Hashanah, had certain ritual requirements, it would have messed up the timing for those ritual requirements. And so in Israel, there were periods when even 2 days were observed for Rosh Hashanah, as it is now, still, referring to the 2 days as Yoma Arichta, one long day. But eventually, the practice that gelled was that for the other holidays, only 1 day would be kept in Israel and 2 days outside the land of Israel, even once it was possible to predict the calendar with highly accurate mathematical calculations. And that's really what pushes our question tonight. Once we're able to determine exactly when the calendar falls, when Rosh Chodesh falls, of what usefulness is the observance of a second day of Yantiv outside of the land of Israel? Now, in order to answer that question, we have to first ask, well, what is the status of that second day? What is its halachic status? Right? What is its legal status within Jewish tradition? In order to ask that question, we have to divide it into two further questions. Is a 2-day Yantiv considered, wherever it's observed, a Yoma Arichta, one long day? Or is it actually considered 2 separate holy days? Kedusha Achat, one holy time, if you will, or Shtei Kedushot, 2 separate holy times. If you see 2 days of Yantiv as one single temporal unit, then you might assume that the rabbis declared that that change of observing 2 days was a permanent change for diaspora communities who were uncertain about Rosh Chodesh. And so those 2 days become one temporal unit and they should be observed for all time. That's one way of thinking about it. If you think about those 2 days as 2 separate temporal units, Shtei Kedushot, then that might lead you to think that the practice was never meant to be permanent, but it was only meant as an accommodation when it was needed. After much discussion in the Talmud about this, the conclusion that is ratified by later generations of halachic authorities, like the Shulchan Aruch, is that the second day of Yantiv does not share the same status as the first day of Yantiv. That it is, in fact, 2 separate days. The conclusion is shtei kedushot hein. And so the suggestion in our medieval codes is that it was never meant to be enacted for all time, and that it was simply an additional measure to address a need in a particular moment. Right? A horat sha'ah is what we call it, something, a teaching for the moment. Other people, to reintroduce a theme that I kind of alluded to before in terms of the political machinations involved here, right? Look, we're studying holy texts, we're studying holy Jewish issues, but Judaism never existed in a vacuum. And the same, I know this will sound very strange to you, those of you who are members of Jewish communities and are involved in Jewish leadership, but sometimes personalities in politics can actually get woven into decisions that communities make. And so some actually saw this as a power play between the ancient Palestinian religious authorities and the Babylonian religious authorities, with the former, the rabbis in Israel, wanting to cement their ultimate authority by claiming to be the ones who have ultimate control over the calendar. Think about it. When you control the calendar, you control the whole experience and observance of Jewish life for Jews all over the world. That is a major power play. Now, the other thing that we have to look at is, apart from what the legal status of 2 days of Yom Tov are, we have to look at what the Talmud had to say around suspending practices that have become a part of the lifestyle, if you will, of a Jewish community. And there's a very interesting conversation in Masechet Beitza in the Babylonian Talmud, where we have a line that is often trotted out in these conversations, which basically says, be careful to observe the customs of your ancestors, what we call minhag avotenu. He's here, bin minhag avotechem beyadechem. Be very careful with the laws of your ancestors that are in your hands. I bet many of you could think of iterations of that within your own families. Ways that you were raised to observe certain traditions, certain holidays, perhaps, that in your own life, and perhaps as parents or leaders in your own families, you think, I don't really want to do it that way. There's another way I want to do it, but my grandparents did it that way. My parents did it that way. I'll give you one from my family life. We went through a decision-making process, Andy and I, together with our kids, about whether we were going to eat kitniot on Pesach, if we were going to eat beans and legumes the way the Sfaradim do. We're not a Sephardi family, but I'm mostly plant-based in my diet, and others in our family are also. And frankly, being able to eat beans and legumes makes a big difference on Pesach. And we studied the issue, and we learned, and it's actually not an issue of halakha, of Jewish law, it's a matter of custom. But part of the calculation that went into our decision-making was, how would this affect our family? I grew up in a family where we didn't eat kitniot. That is my mother's commitment. That's her practice. What would it mean if we decided to eat kitniot? Would my mother sit at my table and eat with us? If she wouldn't, that would have a big impact on our practice. And I'm sure many of you may have similar examples that you've wrestled with as families. So, sure, go ahead.
The issue of kitniot has become more and more on the table because of, not intermarriage, but marriage, Sephardim and Ashkenazim, right? And the old blending of families.
Yeah.
And doesn't only go on in Israel, it goes on everywhere.
Absolutely.
So to keep family peace, there's got to be.
Right. So Asher's noting that the question of kitniot also affects the hybrid families that blend Ashkenazi and Sephardi customs, and it's not only about minhag avotechem, the way your parents or grandparents may have conducted themselves, but it's also the blending of cultural traditions within a single generation of a family, and shalom bayit, and keeping peace within the family. Now, the ancient Palestinian rabbis would often explain the restriction of 2 days of Yom Tov to the diaspora as their concern for the future vulnerability of these communities, in case there would be a time where either the information was lost to those communities, or they wouldn't be able to communicate as easily with the seat of authority in Jerusalem. They were very comfortable changing the patterns of observance for themselves, but less so for the outer line communities, ostensibly because they were concerned for their stability in the future. So again, our big question today is this practice still relevant and necessary here? So let's ask ourselves, is there a risk for any confusion about the calendar in terms of when Rosh Chodesh starts and how to calculate the middle of the month if that's when the holiday starts? No, that's really not a reasonable explanation, because we know we have calendars for thousands of years from now with our knowledge of science and mathematics. So there is no concern about not having accuracy. We have eliminated the question of safek, of doubt. There are no more emergencies, so to speak, that this could protect us from. What that also means is that communities outside of Israel have eliminated the need to be reliant on rabbinical authority in Israel in order to determine appropriate practice wherever they may be around the world. So what happens to a practice in that case? Does it just fall by the wayside? Does it require intentional halachic engagement in order to have a proper resolution? Of course, it requires the kind of attention we're giving it now in terms of learning and really reflecting on it. So let's move deeper into the question of the status of this second day. We've already looked at the question of whether they are those 2 days are one single unit or whether they are two separate, and we've concluded that they are two separate. But now we have to ask another question. Is this practice a matter of minhag, as the Gemara says, be careful? Is it a matter of custom, or does it actually take on the resonance of Jewish law, of halacha, a decree, a gzeira, a decree that was proclaimed in order to put what we call a siyag laTorah, a fence around the Torah, in order to make sure people don't keep the wrong day of Yantiv? I mean, imagine if you keep the wrong day of Yantiv, you might find yourself eating chametz on a day that might still be Pesach. So the stakes are high for people who are committed to these traditions. Or is it possibly a legal enactment that we might call a takana, a radical repair, if you will, to the system in order to address from one point on a deficiency? The decision of whether it is a gzeira or a takana having legal force, or whether it's a matter of custom, is very much also a part of what do we do with this? Can we suspend it? Or must it remain, so to speak, on the books for all time? Hang on to your seats. You'll be shocked to know that there is vast difference of opinion on this question. Before I pause to invite some questions and reflections, let me say a couple of words about this notion of minhag, this notion of custom. Because sometimes, in fact, Susan, you and I were talking about this today, sometimes there's a lot of misimpressions about what actually is just a matter of folk custom or family custom or communal custom, and what really is a matter of law. Most halachic arguments are actually based either implicitly or explicitly on the differences between communities in the realm of minhag, in the realm of custom. How many times does the bride circle around the groom at a wedding, or the bride and groom circle around each other these days, or whether they have to circle at all these days? When is kriya done, the tearing of our garments upon mourning the death of someone who is one of our close relatives? There are differences, of course, as Asher just flagged for us also, between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. Now, there are many different kinds of customs, many different kinds of minhagim that serve many different purposes, depending on the circumstances. Sometimes they can be very private and be parts of an individual expression of religion. Sometimes they're communal expressions, and they take many forms. A personal minhag we might take, for example, Rabbi Akiva. In the Talmud, we learn that when Rabbi Akiva was acting as chazan and leading services, he would be very careful to shorten his prayers so as not to burden the congregation by making them endure a long service. But when he was davening on his own, he was known to engage in lengthy, expanded prayers and rituals, and he would prostrate himself repeatedly, bow repeatedly. It says that he did this so much that he would start his davening in one corner of the room and end up in another corner of the room. But that was a private, personal custom. Other examples, people who put their talit over their head during the Amidah. It's a custom that I have in my davening, and people who don't. There are families where I've been invited for Shabbat dinner where people sit to make Kiddush. In my family, I was raised to stand to make Kiddush, right? So these are all minhagim, and they often are the things that strike us about differences in practices. Sometimes minhagim can be universal in the sense that these are customs that were adopted by whole classes of people. One example actually relates to the laws of family purity, where in the Torah, it is a set period of time, 7 days, when women are meant to separate themselves when they're menstruating. But we learn that women in the Talmudic times took upon themselves an extra measure of stringency, extending the period of separation to much longer. That's a whole class of people who took on that commitment. How about breaking a glass at a wedding? Have you ever been to a Jewish wedding where a glass is not broken? No, those are sort of universally adopted customs. Even waiting between eating meat and milk, that is not a matter of law. That is a matter of custom. Another reason for how varied people's observances of that are. The wearing of a kippah, right? It's a universal practice. We think of it as having almost the force of law, but it's not a halachic expression. It has no legal status. A kippah is a matter of minhag. Finally, some minhagim can be more communal specific. Whether people work on Erev Pesach, whether people work on Chol HaMoed, the middle days of a festival, how Hallel is recited, right? Which verses get repeated, which verses don't. Those are all differences that we see in the life of different Jewish communities. Customs get passed down from generation to generation. Again, this is the language with which, at least as I showed you, one discussion in the Talmud about Yom Tov Sheini is discussed, the language of minhag avotechem, the custom of your ancestors to observe a second day. Now, this doesn't mean that customs have to be passed down from generation to generation. Let's not make that mistake. And it also doesn't mean that innovation is prohibited. If innovation was prohibited, then most customs would have to be abolished, because customs tend to start as an innovation within a community or within a family or within a even individual practice. So it's important to understand these distinctions. A couple of other notes, and then I'm going to stop. If a community has adopted upon itself a certain stringency, then the expectation is that people are not going to flout that stringency in public. And if it becomes a collective custom or stringency, then we would expect for it to be a universally practiced norm. One example, classifying chicken as fleischach. There's plenty of precedent within the Talmudic texts to not consider chicken, poultry, to be meat in the same way that beef is considered meat. And we have, in the Talmud, Rabbi Yosei HaGalili ate chicken parmesan, essentially. We have that. But ultimately, it was universally adopted that chicken would be classified as meat. And anybody today who flouts that acceptance would be seen as violating a standard or norm within the community. We have rabbis in the Talmud saying that if there is no clear law on a particular issue, go and look at what the people are doing. Sometimes custom actually dictated law, right? The rabbis were actually comfortable in certain circumstances saying, you know what? People's practices should inform what the right thing to do is in this case. Now, if a decision had not been rendered, as I just said, the halachic policy would be to follow whatever the community happens to be doing. But the corollary to that principle, you would think, would be that if a court issued a ruling, that it would supersede whatever that practice was. But, of course, that practice had to adhere to Jewish law. But when the popular practice violated rabbinic law and sometimes even biblical law, we might assume that that custom would be dismissed as illegitimate. But that's not always the case. That is not always the case. One easy example of the more obvious position, we call an ir nidachat. If there's a town where the majority is worshiping idols, then you don't look out to see what the majority is doing and saying, oh, look, the majority of the Jewish community is bowing down to idols, so I guess we should bow down to idols. That's not the way it works. And in fact, we're supposed to destroy and wipe out that city. But there are times when customs take stronger root even than law as we might have thought. Many religious authorities who debate the ability of a community to suspend a practice reach for a position in the Talmud which says that the laws passed by a previous court can only be overturned by another court that is greater in wisdom and greater in numbers. Okay, chew on that for a second. The only way that anything could be undone from a previous court's ruling is if you're bigger and better. Now, if there are restrictions on when rabbis can repeal previous rabbis' rulings, then you might think that certainly the mass population and their folkways don't have any greater authority to decide whether to abandon or to keep a precedent. But we do have instances where in the Talmud it's recorded that people were violating rabbinic enactments and the rabbis saw these transgressions but kept silent and decided it was better to just let the Jews be and do what they were doing, right? Hanach lahem li Yisrael, let them be. Better to let them err to sin in error than to sin intentionally by calling them out on it.
Did we give any examples?
Yes. Clapping your hands and dancing on Yom Tov. Seems pretty innocuous to me, but there are discussions in the Gemara of rabbis who felt that that was behavior that was inappropriate on Yom Tov. What were their concerns? Maybe you'd grab an instrument, maybe you'd fix that instrument, Shema Yitakain, can't trust the instincts. So their preference was to rule that those activities should not be engaged in on Yom Tov. But they looked around and people were, sitting at tables and singing and dancing and clapping their hands. And they said, this is really not worth interfering. Okay. Sometimes, as I said before, if there's no law on a particular matter, custom will dictate what to do. If workers are paid by their employers in a certain town every evening, or if it's the custom of employers to give their employees 3 breaks a day, the halakha says you got to do what your people do. You have to be in line with the way work and workers are treated in your community. Sometimes also customs could override an unformed law. Have you ever wondered why no rabbinic authority has come out and declared that smoking is asur, that smoking is prohibited. We have laws on the books in the Torah saying, "V'nishmartem et nafshotechem," you have to take care of your body. You cannot willfully compromise your physical well-being. It's a no-brainer to think then that smoking cigarettes, should be a halachic prohibition. But no rabbi has come out and said so. Plenty of rabbis have come out and said, you shouldn't smoke. I don't know if Rav Ovadia Yosef did. Maybe you know more, Heather, than I do. But many rabbis would say that you shouldn't. But no rabbis have yet said that it is asur. Why? Because we have another principle that we have to consider here. Ein gozrin gzeira al tzibur, ela im kein rov tzibur yachalin la'amod bo. We don't make a decree on the community unless we know that everybody is going to be able to abide by it. So right now you have people who are smoking, who may be imperiling their health, but they're not violating a sin. If you suddenly say that smoking is prohibited, you can't expect that everybody's just going to stop smoking. So you have now in one decree turned people who were not sinners into sinners. And that's an example of how folk practice can sometimes even prevent the passing of halacha. So, is the second day of Yom Tov a law or is it a minhag? And depending on the answer to that comes, after everything we just said, consideration as to, is it suspendable or is it meant to be enacted for all time? Let me pause for a second before we run through the arguments on both sides of those questions. Any questions, comments? Have I confused you?
Smoking for all days or just on Shabbat?
No, smoking in general. Smoking in general, you would think would be in violation of Jewish values. Any questions? Heather.
So I have a question related. I'm just curious if we're considering the 2 days of Yom Tov as separate days.
Yeah.
Why is it that we don't have to make an Eruv Tavshilim every time we have Yom Tov? Right? I mean, like you think because if we have to, have like, all right. So think about like Shavuos when Yom Tov starts quite late. And to prepare the meal, you're starting to cook on the first day of Yom Tov for the second, right?
It's an interesting question. Let's just clarify some terms. So an Eruv Tavshilin, an Eruv is something that mixes things up, like an Eruv that we put up around a neighborhood or a city to be able to carry on Shabbat. Mixes public space and private space so that it's all considered private space and you can carry in your private space. An Eruv Tavshilin is an Eruv of cooked things, literally. And we make an Eruv Tavshilin, we take a baked thing, we take a cooked thing, we make a blessing over it. That's in the case where the second day of Yom Tov or the first, depending on what you're practicing, if it leads into Shabbat. Right? So that we can cook on the second day of Yom Tov for Shabbat. You are correct, Heather, in saying that aside from that, we are only supposed to cook on the day of Yom Tov for that day of Yom Tov. But you can cook on Yom Tov, right? So if you cook when Yom Tov starts at 7 and you start to cook your meal at 7:30, if you're cooking it to eat that evening or the following day lunch, you're fine.
But you can't, so then, let's say, again, for Shavuos, where Yom Tov starts very late, you shouldn't be preparing the meal for the second day until the first day is fully over.
That is the way it's traditionally observed, yes. Yeah. Any other questions? Shirley and Avram.
Yeah, the Torah is very specific about holidays, the number of days.
Yes.
So now that regardless of where Jews live, we possess the knowledge of how many days it should be, is it not a good thing that we can go back to observing the Torah as it has been written?
All right, thank you for that question. Now you're pushing us into Tachlis. I gave you a little background on Minhag, on where this all came from. Now let's dive in. So for those, I'm going to get to your question, Avram, but I'm going to get there in a methodical way. Okay, let's take the first question. Is it a minhag? Is it a matter of halacha? For those who would advocate that it is just a custom, what are the arguments that advance that position? So there are those who say that the rabbinic literature around this issue refer to it as a minhag, like the text from Masechet Beitza that I quoted you. He's right to be careful with minhag avoteichem, with the customs of your forefathers, in discussing this issue. Remember that when they were able to communicate to outer lying communities when Rosh Chodesh started, then nobody observed this second day. It was a matter of necessity only. And when it wasn't necessary, then it wasn't observed. So that gives people arguing that it was just a custom the oomph to say this has never been a matter of law. It wasn't a gzeira, it wasn't a takana, it wasn't a decree, it wasn't an upgrading of the tradition. And so it can more easily be changed when the circumstances no longer require it. My grandfather actually weighed in on this and said, even if you want to argue that it was a gzeira, that it was a rabbinic decree, because of the concerns about uncertainties for Jewish communities that might be under hostile rule of non-Jewish authorities, my grandfather argued, we live in the miraculous era of having Medinat Yisrael, of having the state of Israel. We no longer have those fears. And so there's no justification for perpetuating a gzeira, even if you think that's what it is, in the circumstances in which we find ourselves right now. And also, actually, along those lines, in reaction to those who constantly trot out this notion that, rabbinical authorities cannot undo decrees of previous rabbinical authorities unless they are greater in wisdom and number. In a really interesting essay on being a modern religious authority, being a modern posek, my grandfather asked the question, how could any human Beit Din, court of rabbis, make a decision conditioned by the needs of the generation they were serving and presume that that decision would remain applicable and resonant for all time and for all people in all places? It doesn't make any sense. Those people who advance the idea that this is a matter of custom point to the fact that these days are seen as two distinct days. And the fact that there were fluctuations in their observance shows that it is not a matter of law. In the pieces that I shared with you to read, Rabbis Philip Siegel and Abraham Ehrlich, way back in 1969, similarly reject the idea that we are powerless as authorities in our own generations to make decisions that are more appropriate for our own times and our communities. And in a statement that may seem provocative to some, declared that we outside of Israel no longer look to Jerusalem as the ultimate arbiter of what is necessary in Jewish communities around the world. Rabbi Aaron Blumenthal, also from the 1960s, argued another point, saying that when there's a conflict between the biblical commandment and a custom, we might just assume that we always defer to the Torah. But that's not always the case. This is what I was getting to earlier when I said, hang on, and we'll get back to this. Consider this. In the laws of inheritance, according to the Torah, you would be really lucky to be a firstborn because you would inherit double, right? However, the custom in Israel today, I'm going to use Israel as an example because it really brings it home most powerfully. The custom in Israel today, which has been formalized by law in the Knesset and accepted by the chief rabbinate in Israel, is that children inherit equally. So that's a great example. The Torah says one thing, and not only do we in our, you might even think in our lapsed diaspora mindsets, can't hold up what the Torah says. This is the chief rabbinate in Israel, who in our own time and day is saying, sorry, Torah, but we're going to do things differently. Now, that's not news. The Torah has never had the last word. And I don't say this to be egregiously blasphemous. I say this to honor the fact that we are the inheritors of a tradition that is so secure in itself that it welcomes the ongoing interpretation of its application in different times and places. So much so that it actually is iterated in a verse in Devarim at the end of the Torah where it says very clearly, the Torah itself says, if there is a matter of law that is unclear to you and you don't know how to decide, go and seek the counsel of your elders. In other words, the Torah, regardless of whatever any of our specific beliefs are around who wrote the Torah, is it divine, is it humanly inspired, however you fall out on that question, the Torah itself anticipated its own limitations. The Torah acknowledges that it does not contain the prescriptions of how to live a Jewish life for all time and in all places. It acknowledges there will be moments that need clarification from the wise elders in that time and in that place. The Torah is the very document that established that imperfection is actually perfection, that limitation is actually what leads us for the Torah to be limitless in its resonance and in its relevance. So those are the arguments on the part of those who believe that this is a matter of custom. When it comes to those who argue that it's a matter of law, the arguments suppose that it cannot be so easily set aside. I shared with you the tshuva of Rabbi Wilfred Shushat, Alav HaShalom, who's the rabbi of the Shar Shemaim here in Montreal, who in 1969, in a tshuva, said that whenever the rabbis in the Talmud refer to hinhigu minhag, that our ancestors, I love that language, custom to custom, right? It's like what we say, actually, this was the first of our Torah that I gave here at Shari Zion way back in October, where I gave a Dvar Torah on the uniqueness of the language in the Mariv blessing, Hama'ariv Aravim, the one who evenings evening, right? Rabbi Shushat said that when it says hinhigu minhag, that they custom to custom, it means to him, he reads that as saying that the rabbis took what started as custom and ratified it as law, turned it into halakha, and he argues that's what happened with the second day of Yom Tov. Maybe it started as a custom, maybe it fluctuated depending on whether you could get the memo or not get the memo as to when Rosh Chodesh was, but ultimately, the rabbis imposed a stringency on it such that it became law. And he quotes a 14th century authority who says that at first people took it upon themselves to observe a second day when they felt they needed it, but then the later sages fixed it as a takana, even after they knew how to fix the luach, even after they knew how to predict the calculations of the calendar. So he argues that you cannot undo such a piece of rabbinic legislation unless, and here he trotted out that well-worn teaching, unless you have a Beit Din, a court of law, that is equal or greater in stature and authority as the ancient sages. And by the way, he also took this concept of the 2 days of Yom Tov being shtei kedushot, two separate sacred times, and said that referred only to the second days as it was sometimes observed in Israel when messengers couldn't reach towns in Israel proper, and it was kept out of mishum safek as a matter of doubt. But he said that in the diaspora communities, the 2 days that were kept were considered kedusha achat, one single temporally sacred day, and were binding as such and equally binding, equally holy. He even refers to the fact that there were communities where if you weren't observing the second day of Yom Tov, you could have been put into cherem. You could have been excommunicated. And he sees that as support for seeing this as a matter of inviolable law. It's a very famous case that he raises in his tshuva from the 17th century in, I think it was the 17th century. Two Jews are in Florence for Yom Tov. It's nice. You know, it's not only in our day that we go away for Pesach, right? They were in Florence for Yom Tov. One of them was from Israel, lived in Israel, and the other was from somewhere else from the diaspora. They were there for Pesach together. And comes the seventh day of Pesach, which is the last day of Pesach for the person from Israel, but the second to last Pesach for the person who lives in the diaspora. And lo and behold, you can hear the Hanukkah story in here. Lo and behold, they only had 1 cup of wine. They only had 1 cup of wine. And they didn't know what to do. Should that cup of wine be used by the person from Israel to make Havdalah on the end of Pesach? Or should that cup of wine be given to the person who lives in the diaspora for them to make Kiddush that night on the next day of Yom Tov? Nu, Chevra, who wants to play rabbi for a minute? What do you do?
Give it to the guy that's keeping 2 days.
So Asher says you give it to the guy who's keeping 2 days and let him make Kiddush with it. Anybody have any other?
Yeah.
Hi, Jordan.
Hi, how's it going? I mean, wine isn't, it's not a binary. It's divisible. It's infinitely divisible.
So interesting point. Yes, you could have split that cup of wine in half, but of course you need certain measurements in order for the cup to be, filled appropriately to make Kiddush. But a point that you might be making after that comment is that you could make Havdalah on something other than wine, right? You can make Havdalah on anything, on orange juice, you can make Havdalah, right? But what happened was that the local rabbi ruled in favor of the Jew from Israel, that he should use it to make Havdalah, but he was scolded by his colleagues. And Rabbi Shushat uses that as proof that it's more important to preserve the second day of Yom Tov. And it has been observed for 2,000 years without real protest. And so he concludes.
You have today's situations where Israelis have to keep an extra day of Pesach when it falls out. Shvi is on Friday.
Yes, like this year.
Whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
Whatever.
This coming year.
So they can't eat.
Right.
Chametz.
Asher points out that those who keep 1 day of Yom Tov in the diaspora, or those who are in Israel this year, the seventh day of Pesach is on a Friday. So, Heather, we may be able to make Eruv Tavshilins to be able to cook, but there's no Eruv, Chametz u'matzah. So you can't get your chametz back yet. So perforce, no matter how you observe this coming year, you're going to be eating matzah and kosher Pesach food on the 8th day, whether you keep it or not. Okay, so there's a difference of opinion, as we've seen, whether it's a custom or whether it's a law, and that leads to differences of opinion as to whether it's suspendable or it needs to be kept. So let's look at the arguments of those who say that in order to that you have to keep the second day of Yom Tov, like Rabbi Shushat did, whether you think it's because it's a matter of law or whether you think it's a matter of custom and because of that it should be maintained. There are additional reasons that were layered on top of that as to why it should be kept, and these are the reasons that Rabbi Shushat brings beyond the law versus custom debate. He says, and many others have said it as well, that we need to beef up Jewish life in the diaspora. We need to reinforce it. We need to intensify it to make up for the fact that we do not live in Israel. It's not an uncommon sensibility. Because if we don't live in Israel, we are, by some rabbinic perspectives, living in a state of spiritual exile. And so we need that extra day of Yom Tov in order to nourish ourselves spiritually. Rabbi Shushat, in his tshuva that I shared with you, spoke about how the second day of Yom Tov is a reminder of the spiritual superiority of Israel, and that if it's experienced as a hardship to keep the second day, that should be a motivation to people to make aliyah. If you're not comfortable with it, then go and live in Israel. Even though if you're not going to live in Israel, the observance of the second day should count as some kind of redemptive activity to justify the fact that you have chosen to live in the diaspora. It's kind of an interesting position. On the one hand, it should be a goad for you to go and make aliyah. On the other hand, it's kind of the least we can do if we decide to stay, if you will, to make up for that spiritually. And just because we can get on a plane anytime we want to go to Israel, he said, does not make up for the fact that we have decided not to make our lives there. And that decision should somehow play out in our spiritual observance. For people who find it to be a hardship, he acknowledges that much about Jewish life outside of a comprehensive Jewish society like Israel is experienced as a hardship. Keeping kosher is hard. Keeping Shabbat is hard. The pressures to assimilate. And that the more we feel at home here, he argued, the more threatened we might be as a community. And so keeping a tradition like the second day of Yom Tov serves to remind us that we are in an imperfect state, that we are living in an imperfect place, so to speak. Sure, Asher.
So some might say that having two seders keeps Shalom Bayit because we're able to go to one set of grandparents.
That's the other 2 days.
Right.
On the other hand, I'm the one that would argue one seder is enough. The second one doesn't mean as much because it's so,
Right.
it's just repeating
Right.
repetitive. So
Asher's pointing out that there's a convenience to having 2 days of Yom Tov, particularly around Pesach, having two seders, being able to, share and being in different families' homes. One day might take that away. I would argue one day doesn't actually take that away because if anything, it could free up the second night to do something really creative, to do things that you wouldn't have done perhaps on the first night. Shirley and Avram.
Why would there have been any doubt about the start of Shavuot, seeing that Shavuot is dependent upon the start of Pesach, and there's a formula of counting the Omer?
Yep.
And can I add another piece to that? How did they reconcile Yom Kippur? Because we don't have 2 days of Yom Kippur. So how do they reconcile?
Great questions. Great questions. So yes, you could discover the right time to start Shavuot by counting the days of the Omer and knowing when the end of the Omer was and Shavuot would be celebrated. But Shavuot fell into the same patterns as the other holidays would be because it would simply be illogical to have Sukkot and Pesach observed one way and Shavuot observed a different way, is how I imagine the architects of this tradition would have felt about that. There's also some debate between Jewish communities as to the dates of those holidays and when you start counting the Omer. That's a whole separate question. But it's a fair point, Avram. Surely, with regards to your question, there is no justification for the fact that Yom Kippur is not subject to the same second day of Yom Tov, but for the fact that the rabbis realized that you cannot impose 2 days of fasting on people. So there you have it. So, okay, just to summarize again, Rabbi Shushat's additional positions, right? The second day of Yom Tov was more than just a religious rite. It's a symbol that you are not living in Israel. He Okay, I'm gonna leave his tshuva there. Heather, you wanted to say something else, or yeah?
So I'm just struggling with this because not that I don't understand the rationale, or not that I don't understand the basis of it, but it's very interesting to me that we're looking at this really with kind of an attitude of the second day being a tircha, being a burden, being like this, oh, if we could just stop observing the second day, which is really interesting because, of course, we started the whole shiur with v'samachta, right?
Bingo. Bonus points to you.
So what's going on?
But that's not fair. That's not fair. So what's going on? So Rabbi Shushat in his tshuva addresses that point head on, saying, if people find the second day of Yom Tov to be a tircha, to be a burden, then he actually says that he would bet that those same people might find everything about observant Jewish life a burden. They might find that it's really, a burden to keep kosher, a burden to keep Shabbat, a burden to keep, to daven, a burden to participate in all the ways that the tradition requires that we participate. And so he says the claim that it's a burden really is not a valid claim. And he rejects the argument that anybody is suffering financially from observing a second day, right? If you lose a day of work, if you're a university student and you lose a day of classes, he rejects those lines of argument, sort of expressing what you're expressing, that this should be a time of joy. This should be a time of appreciation. There are many people who love having the second day of Yom Tov, having another day of family time, of community time, of ritual time. By the way, even in Israel, where they observe one day, Sheini Atzeret, Simchat Torah, in one day. So one night of hakafot, right? According to the law, one night of singing and dancing with the Torah. In Israel, it's become very popular to have hakafot shniyot, to have another night of hakafot. Now it's beyond the time of the religious observance of the holiday. And so you see communities like putting together bands. They wouldn't necessarily, even Orthodox communities, they wouldn't necessarily play their instruments on the night before when they did hakafot, because they don't play musical instruments on Yom Tov in those communities. But the second night after that, when it's no longer Yom Tov, but hey, we love singing and dancing with the Torah, massive celebrations of all kinds. So to your point, this should be time that people love. He also calls for communities to be very creative and inventive with the second day of Yom Tov. There should be differences. You should bring in new themes. You should have creative rituals. You should make it feel different. It shouldn't just be a repetition of the first day, he argues, precisely to bring out the kind of feelings that you're talking about. He does ultimately conclude that shuls that have a robust second day of Yom Tov attendance and engagement should not be asked to abandon the second day of Yom Tov, but we shouldn't say that communities that decide to suspend the second day of Yom Tov are in any way violating the law. He kind of reaches that compromise position. And so people should be at peace with their decisions based on the needs of their communities.
Question, wait, so doesn't, let's say, economics and entrepreneurship come into this? As you said before, like, a lot of families go away for Sukkot, for Pesach, and obviously having the extra day, puts it in the hands of the tour companies and make more money, and, the whole business, the kosher business. So is that of any relevance?
Relevance in the sense that we're feeding the Jewish economy by keeping a second day of Yom Tov?
Yeah, something like we're keeping families, spending more time together.
Listen, there's lots of benefits to having more time when families and communities are able to be together. I mean, that's not arguable. But let's look at the arguments that have been advanced by those who believe that the time has come to suspend the second day of Yom Tov and see how those play out also. Now, I've done a little trick on you. It's not a trick, really, but one of the reasons why I really enjoy teaching this issue is because it forces us to reconsider our assumptions when we engage with questions of modern Jewish law. We're looking at the question of suspending what many people take as a beloved and certainly presumed feature of contemporary Jewish life, observing a second day of Yom Tov in the diaspora. The question of suspending it, you might think, is a pretty radical, sort of challenging question. And you might expect that those who advocate for suspending it come from a certain segment of the Jewish community that is more comfortable with change, i.e., communities outside of the Orthodox, like the community that Rabbi Shushat led, which certainly at the time of Rabbi Shushat's leadership, I think was more comfortable considering itself a conservative shul than perhaps today. And you might think that those advocating for maintaining these precedents would come from the Orthodox community. What those of you who read these tshuvot in anticipation of tonight's class might have discovered, and what I will now share with all of you, is that it's actually Rabbi Shushat who argued for the maintaining of this tradition. And it's my late grandfather, Rabbi Mendel Lewittes, Alev Shalom, who was the rabbi of Young Israel here, who argued for suspending the second day. My point being, you cannot assume that someone's denominational badge will dictate where they fall out on any given issue, right? That these are discussions that people bring the fullness of their beliefs, their values, and their commitments to in the striving to decide what direction really is worthy of this moment and the communities they were leading. The argument in a nutshell that my grandfather made on this issue is the argument known in halachic discourse of nishtanu hazmanim. The times have changed. The times have changed. He argued that travel between Israel and every other country in the world is so easy, so accessible, and so common that the distinction between Israel and Jewish communities around the world has become more and more diminished. He argued that people are coming to Israel for Chag, as you just said, Asher, right? People like to travel for Yom Tov. And the situation of having people from the diaspora in Israel for Yom Tov observing differently than the people they're there to be with, than the communities that they're there to be with, makes absolutely no sense and flies in the face of another value discussed by the rabbis, which is to follow minhag hamakom. It's the rabbinic way of saying when in Rome, right? If you're in Israel, you should be observing the way Israelis observe. It makes no sense. My grandfather, all of us were blessed to spend a year in Israel when we were young, and we would be there for the Chagim, and my grandfather guided us that we should only observe one day of Yom Tov. Right? Now, some people think, okay, if you're going to be there for all three pilgrimage festivals, then you're there for sort of long enough period of time to observe one day with everybody else. But eventually my grandfather argued, just keep one day. And other rabbis kept ruling, no, if you don't live in Israel, but you're in Israel for Yom Tov, you have to keep two. What my grandfather was also concerned about, as he wrote, is in creating division within the Jewish people, right? The mitzvah, the lav ta'aseh, the prohibition against lo tidgodedu, that we should not be creating pockets of Jewish communities that are differing from each other. We shouldn't be fragmenting the Jewish world, is what he was arguing. We should be striving for shared customs, shared practices. Granted, there are differences in the way some of them are kept. We talked about kitniot before, sit, stand for kiddush, what have you. But by and large, he advocated for a sense of collective practice. And just to state the obvious, he, for one, felt the same about Israelis who come to the diaspora over holidays. Right? So long as we have these two separate habits of Israelis keeping one and diaspora Jews keeping two, having Israelis in the diaspora creates also disunity. I remember so many Yom Tovs that my grandparents would come from Jerusalem to be with us, and how awkward it was for my grandfather on the second day of Yom Tov, which he would no longer keep because he's an Israeli. And the way he conducted himself, and where would he go and where would he not go? The other layer of nishtanu hazmanim, that the times have changed, is something that has to do with economics. And he speaks very powerfully about that. So long as we continue to wish for us as a Jewish community to be integrated into the societies in which we are living, then we have to understand that there are consequences in the decisions we make about when and how to separate ourselves. And there are real financial hardships for people where taking a second day of Yom Tov means not being able to work and not being able to earn, and students not being able to go to university and falling behind in classes, in exams, in internships. So, there was an argument made by people who suggested keeping the second day of Yom Tov as an insurance policy in case your job prevents you from keeping the first day, at least you'll have the second day, right? But that would create the same issues. Observing more than is both biblically mandated and scientifically mandated creates the tircha, that burden, if you will. My grandfather wrote about how if you really want to privilege Israel, if you really want to honor Israel as the primary model of Jewish spirituality and observance, then we ought to be emulating Israel, not keeping ourselves different from it. We should be aligning ourselves with Israel and the way Jewish life is lived there. Exactly the opposite argument of Rabbi Shushat, who was my grandfather's colleague and friend. We privilege Israel when it comes to tzedakah. So why wouldn't we privilege Israel when it comes to our calendar and our observances? There are other rabbis who argued that given some of the contentiousness around this issue, if we were to observe one day of Yom Tov and we were to suspend the second day of Yom Tov, maybe it would lead people who reject the whole concept of Yom Tov because it's too overwhelming to begin with, to take another look at least investing themselves in one day of observance. If people were able to see that the law is, that the tradition is progressive, rational, evolutionary, dynamic, innovative, that it has the capacity to continue to improve on itself, maybe that would cultivate greater respect and appreciation for the tradition. What do you think? Tell me where you guys are at. Second day of Yom Tov. Don't be shy. Is it a custom? Is it a law? Can it be suspended? Ought it be suspended? Or tell me about your own experiences of the second day of Yom Tov. Is it something that enriches you? Is it something that burdens you? Somewhere in between?
Like you said before, you gotta go by your community. I think, Montreal, being very traditional, stands by keeping, second days as just a law.
So, if you weren't able to hear, Asher points out that the Montreal Jewish community writ large, not just Shar Zion Beth-El, relates to the second day of Yom Tov as an established feature of Jewish life, and that is the default observance here. Is that fair? That may be the case, but I'm still interested in how you think about this. Or are you saying that given the fact that it's the default position, that's where you fall out?
No, just again, that's the way I was brought up. It just enhances. Now that I'm working in religion and synagogue life, it enhances because I don't know, can teach more, engage people more, connect more, so it gives more available, opportunities.
Yeah.
That way.
As a synagogue leader, Asher points out that having a second day of Yom Tov just creates more touchstones, more opportunities for engagement, and that there's value in that. Who else? Morton.
I'll just comment about Asher's point first. the reduced attendance on the second day of Yom Tov is very discouraging. And so I'm not sure that it's an enhancement of the experience of the holiday. But Asher and I could talk about that another time. I was struck by the fact that of the criteria in which a law could be overturned. And it struck me that, okay, even if you accept it's a law, you would have to say that there came a point in the 2000 years when rabbis were indeed wiser just by virtue of the fact that they had the science, they had access to the science. And there came a time when rabbis were indeed wiser when they had access to the fact that communication with Israel is instantaneous. And so the wisdom has to be about the issue. It's not just were they definitely wiser overall, but about the issue, they were definitely wiser.
Yeah.
And then it's also the case that you would have a network of rabbis that was larger than the network of previous generations, especially now that we have all the internet and the Zoom meeting. I mean, so there's this network of rabbis. So it seems to me that the issue of whether you could overturn it is answered. Yes, it seems to me in my mind that it would be trivial to say yes, it's wiser rabbis and there's a broader network of rabbis. That's very different from saying ought we. Just because one can doesn't mean one ought to. I'm persuaded by the arguments of your grandfather that it is better to have common practice than discontinuities of practice. So I would come down on the side of having the common practice, and I don't think it would be possible to persuade Israelis to adopt a second day of Yom Tov. So, which tells us something, because if you do the thought experiment, you know that would never work.
Right.
So it seems to me that going with one day of Yom Tov would make a lot of sense and would be very possible.
Or not, I must point out that as I'm trying to think of a neutral word without giving away my own orientation on this issue. But as bold, let's say, as my grandfather's position was for a person in his position, for a rabbi in his position, he did qualify, in case you didn't read his statement, as he did with a number of other areas of halacha that he advocated on, that for him to feel comfortable in making any kind of generalized changes, he would want to see a reconstituted Sanhedrin. He would want to see a body of global rabbinic authorities who could speak for the community, at least that he was a part of, the modern Orthodox community. And he's actually very explicit that he would want to make sure that body of rabbis was made up of at least a certain number, a sizable number, who were also university educated, not just yeshiva educated. But the point in sharing that is not only to round out my grandfather's position, but I want to remind us all that historically, centers of Jewish authority, or let me say it this way, rabbinic authority has always been decentralized authority. Authority has always been localized authority, right? Communities turn to the rabbis that they believe are the appropriate, most trustworthy authorities to guide them in the specifics of their lives. And so there's precedent, as we have seen, on all sides of this issue, to take a position that is grounded and rooted. Whether it's your reading of what constitutes a powerful enough baiting to make such a choice, or just determining it to be a matter of custom. I just want to emphasize that in this conversation, as with all other conversations of Jewish law, that rabbinic authority ultimately is a decentralized authority, and we have to take into account where we are and the relationships that we have between rabbis and communities. Lynn, you had your hand up. Oh, and then Gila, and then Heather.
Yeah, I did. It was sort of a follow-on to the comment about the decreased attendance on the second day. I mean, I have no knowledge in an Orthodox community, but in, conservative, reconstructionist, reform, whatever, right? I mean, there is such a minuscule attendance in most places on the second day, unless it happens to fall on a weekend. And, a lot of reform synagogues, I think, don't even have a service on the second day.
That is correct. The Reform movement has dispensed with the second day of Yom Tov.
Right. So
and many conservative schools as well.
Right. So so you have probably a larger, or at least a reasonably large population of Jews that are not practicing this observance. And you made some comment earlier about the rabbis, how they dealt with that when so many people in the community were not observing something. So why doesn't that come into play?
It does, in the sense that there have been conservative communities who have made the decision, in part driven by the realities that Morton flagged in terms of waning attendance, that have made the decision to suspend the observance of the second day of Yom Tov. And it is considered a valid position within the network of conservative congregations. So it does live in that way. And there are many conservative rabbis who argue on principle that this should no longer be a feature of contemporary Jewish life outside of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I all of that makes sense to me. Though I will say, I do generally enjoy the second day Rosh Hashanah services because they tend to be so much more creative and interesting.
So that's another. Look, most synagogues, even though the high holy days are the high holy days, the second day of Rosh Hashanah also is a day on which there's a lot of drop off from people who find it cumbersome to be in shul for that many hours for that heavy a service. And that has led many rabbis, myself included, when I ran a sha'ar, to utilize the second day and to utilize the attention of people knowing Rosh Hashanah is 2 days. You're not going to change that. It's 2 days even in Israel too. To utilize that second day to engage people in different ways around the themes of Rosh Hashanah, but using some different spiritual technologies, if you will. And that's one way of addressing the second day of Yom Tov. And Rabbi Shushat calls for that also. He called in his tshuva for us to use that time differently. And there was a comment here also from someone who said, if we keep 1 day of Yom Tov, from Maryland, if we keep 1 day of Yom Tov, maybe it would inspire younger people to re-engage. But maybe we could also use the second day as a day of study, as a day of learning for those who want to keep that pattern of observance. Let me turn to Heather again. No, to Gila, and then to Heather.
I don't know. For me, the Jewish holidays are about, you don't have to see me. I don't know if you can hear me, but the Jewish holidays are all about family. And since I got married, it's just made family life peaceful because I spend 1 day with, now I can have 25 people in my house and I do bring both families together, but I spend 1 day with, we started out by spending 1 day with my family and 1 day with my husband's family. And I think that's the best thing ever. And And so it will go with my children, and it's never ending. It just gives me 2 days of opportunity, having nothing to do with religion whatsoever, yet observing and coming to shulas when we did really observe. To me, it's the best thing ever. I don't know, unless everybody just has these perfect families and everyone gets together and like, it's all like really great. Doesn't everybody just appreciate having those 2 days to, especially on Rosh Hashanah and Pesach, to be able to split up and yet
Right.
still be together?
So-
To me, that's everything. Like, so crucial.
So second day of Rosh Hashanah is not going anywhere.
Yeah.
That's really not up for discussion. And as we said, there are ways to keep us, and also after the first day of Pesach, it's still Pesach, right?
Yeah, but
Either it's Chol HaMoed or it's not, but it's not Yantiv, right? So what you're saying is just having the framing of Yantiv is the motivator for people to say,
maybe, yeah.
it's time to
For
be
us,
together.
maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people would relate to that. Heather? Sorry. Go ahead, just unmute yourself.
Yeah, so it's me. So such a great discussion, and I appreciate it. And it's so interesting because these are probably the 24 people who will be in shul on the second day and might be comfortable saying we don't have to. So, but seriously, so like, so the process is so important, and this diving into tradition is so important. And there are the bigger questions of why are we doing this, and what are we doing, and what's important for our own spiritual growth and for strengthening the community and for sort of doing good in the world. And to me, using all this, but those questions, applying those broader lenses for me personally are what's important. I know for me, I've had the fortune of being able to take off second day Yom Tov and planning that for all of my career. And it's sometimes very challenging for me, and it's sometimes very challenging for my colleagues and people who have to plan around me or who work for me or who I work for. So there's tachlis in there in the context of sort of bigger questions that we may care about in terms of this whole endeavor. You're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry. I really appreciate you sharing that, Steve, because the process that we're engaging in is actually, or arguably, more important than whatever decision we ultimately come to, right? It's a process of taking ourselves seriously as Jews, taking ourselves seriously as modern Jews. And if you look on any page of Gemara, on any page of Talmud, thank you, the most common phrase that you'll encounter is, my Tama. Why? Why? What is the reason for this? Why are we doing this? Does it still make sense? How can we do it in a way that's relevant and that's meaningful for us? So, I appreciate your honesty about both the burdens and the blessings of this particular tradition, but I appreciate even more your reminding us of how important it is that we come together to learn and to wrestle, and to appreciate the fact that what is right for one community might not be right for another community. What is right for one family might not be right for another family. What is right for one member of a family might not be right for the whole family. I'll tell you only this. Andy and I feel very differently about this issue. And she's not on tonight, but it has been a source of really, I would say, interesting, sometimes difficult conversation between us. I'll let you guys stay in suspense as to who feels what.
Nothing like that happens ever in our household.
I'm sure not.
Never.
I am sure not. What I want to leave you with is actually along the lines of what you had just said. That all of us see it as not just our opportunity, but our responsibility to engage with, to use a phrase of my grandfather's in some writing of his, the eternal contemporaneousness or contemporaneity, if you will, of our tradition, right? The timeless relevance of Judaism. I've said this so many times, right? why it is that the Torah is not sitting under plexiglass in a museum next to the Magna Carta is precisely because the Torah itself invites us into this conversation. The Torah mandates that we have these conversations to make sure that we can always answer my tama, to understand that ultimately revelation is a dialogue between human beings and the divine in whatever sense that word is meaningful. You know, if the medieval rabbinic authorities in talking about Torah emphasized the role of the giver in that story, right? The role of God. When we go back to the earlier layers of our tradition, to the Talmudic sages, there was much more emphasis on the role of the recipient of Torah and the importance of human agency and the sacredness of subjectivity in determining how is this meant to live in our lives in a way that is instructive and powerful and meaningful. Rather than see questions about suspending this or suspending that, I actually prefer to look at these conversations and see how they point to the expansiveness of halakha, that it is this never-ending effort to determine the best way for Jews to walk in this world, which is what halakha really means, to be in a process of halicha, of movement, of progress, of continuous expansion. If we think of Yirat Hashem, the fear or awe that leads us to surrender and to submit, we have to also understand that Ahavat Hashem, the love that we feel for the divine, for the tradition, is sometimes expressed in the willingness to rethink, to reimagine, to reinterpret, and to reapply, because it's love for something that we want to make sure is always meaningful and relevant to us. So with that, we're going to end this 4-session series of jurisprudence, looking at some of the frontier questions in Jewish law. I want to thank you so much for being a part of this learning experience with me. I look forward to having more opportunities to study and to do what we do best, just to learn, to debate, and ultimately care about Jewish life today, tomorrow, and always. So I'm going to end as we always do with Kaddish to Rabbanan, having engaged and studied together. And I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible over Shabbat here at Shari Zion Beth-El, tomorrow night at services, at dinner tomorrow night, and at Shabbat morning.
Thank you.
Please unmute yourself, so if you like to be able to say Amen. Yitgadal v'yikedash shemei Rabbah. Be'omad yivrach yirteh v'yamlich malchoteh b'chayechon v'yamechon v'chay d'chol beit Yisrael b'agala b'zman kariv yimru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam olam barach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitalev v'yitalel shmei dekudesha baruch hu le'lam yingo b'chatav v'shirata tishb'chatav v'nechmata damiran ve'omad v'yimru Amen. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Talmidehon v'al kol Talmidehon v'al kol mandei oskim be'oraita diva atra ha'dein v'di b'chol atar v'atar yehi lohonu l'chon shlama Rabbah China v'chista v'rachamim v'chayina rechina muzana revicha u'forkana min kodam avuhan b'shmaya v'imru Amen. Yehi shlama Rabbah min shemaya v'chayim tovim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Oseh shalom v'imru amav u'barachamav ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Laila tov, everyone. Stay well, stay healthy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Night, Dini.
Good night. Good night, Howard.
Yeah.
Good night.